Okay, so I just started the integrity recording. Um, no, as I say, I like to run them from my flash drive because sometimes if I'm trying to run the PowerPoint on these old computers and record something in integrity, it doesn't do it. For Aristotle, there were two types of virtues, both of which had to do with his concept of us as basically rational animals. And we're going to get in a little while to his definition of a human being as essentially a rational creature. That reason for him is what separates us from the rest of life on Earth, from non-human animals in particular. So both of the types of virtues have to do with our exercising what he thinks is our chief essential nature, our reasoning nature. We're not going to look at the intellectual virtues, but they have to do with learning things. Remember, Aristotle had a lot of interests outside of philosophy. He wrote books on physics and botany, for instance. Now, of course, Aristotle's physics didn't go look anything like the physics you studied in high school if you took that course. But he, he valued getting theoretical knowledge. But we're going to focus on his concept of a moral virtue. Now, Aristotle is not the first Greek philosopher to focus on character traits and focus on the issue of what kind of person ought we to be if we're going to be a virtuous person. Plato before him, and I'm not going to go here very much, but Plato before him thought that as human beings, we had a kind of three-tiered nature. We had a rational part of us, we had an emotional part of us, and we had what he thought was the lower nature, having to do with fulfilling things like the desires associated with our bodily needs. And for Plato, our lower nature, which he called the appetitive part, the part having to do with our appetites, basically the virtue associated with that was self-control or temperance. And we're going to see Aristotle discusses the same virtue. And with our emotional part, he thought that our emotions were not all bad, like Freud said. And aggression for him was not necessarily bad. If we control our emotions and aggression, Plato thought we would become virtuous persons. We would develop the virtue of courage. So courage is associated for him with the emotional part. And for Plato, with our rational part, you can probably guess what the chief, virtue is. It's of course wisdom, the virtue that philosophers seek. Philosophy being the love of wisdom, and some philosophers even before him looked at virtues this way. So Aristotle is in the same tradition with Plato, thinking that talking about human virtue is in large measure talking about the character traits that would be those of a virtuous person. And so for Aristotle, virtue has to do with character traits and whether we can develop them or whether we have them by nature. And sometimes, for Aristotle as for Plato, developing a virtuous character trait, acting virtuously, sometimes means acting contrary to our impulses. For instance, for Plato, to develop a virtuous character trait of, say, temperance, very often would mean focusing on and overcoming our tendencies to go overboard in the areas of satisfying the desires of our body for things like food, drink, and sexual fulfillment. And so Aristotle is much the same way, but he comes up with a different model of virtue. Now it's good to see everyone here, but again, I'll remind you, that it's distracting for your classmates. You're not going to distract me, right? I told you, talking in front of a class is like a pitcher. And I wasn't very good, but I did some pitching in sandlot baseball. A major league pitcher doesn't even notice the 40,000 people in the stands. His world is the batter and the target of his catcher and what he's got to do, and that's what he's focusing on, and everything else fades into the distance. And that's the way it is. When you're up here talking, you're focusing on what you want to say, and it's not as noticeable to me that people are walking in the middle of my lecture as someone comes in on cue, but it is very distracting, to be pulled away, and we're not getting down on you because I had some other people come in late, and it's good to have you here, but please try to make more of an effort to get here on time, because as I said, it is distracting if you walk in even 5 or 10 minutes late. Even though, while it's good to have you here. Okay, so Aristotle, though, is very practical. He's not looking at the virtuous life as some kind of contemplative life, like a Far Eastern mystic might look at it. But for him, virtues are acquired in the real world by exercising them. It's kind of a circular thing for Aristotle. I mean, this whole idea of developing a character trait, right? He says developing a particular virtuous character trait like courage or self-control, temperance, is like acquiring any other skill. So he doesn't think that, well, either you're born courageous or not. Either you're born with self-control or not. We're going to do a unit on free will later on where people might argue that point. But for Aristotle, we can overcome our tendencies and develop virtuous character traits even if we don't have them. But how do we do this? Well, he says we learn and develop virtuous character traits in the same way we develop any other skill. My dad was doing work after he got out of the service in World War II. Was working as a painter. And it was really getting to his lungs. He was having problems with asthma. And so my parents got married right after World War II in 1946. So I'm very literally a baby, part of the post-World War II baby boom. But she suggested that my dad go to carpentry school. In other words, learn a different trade than painting, something that would not give him the problems he was having with his lungs. And so that's what he did. He went to school on what was then the GI Bill, that paid for the training of veterans, and learned to be a carpenter, and was a carpenter for most of his adult life. And the thing is, I've got in my living room a shelf that he, a kind of knick-knack shelf, which was one of the things he built when he was in carpentry school. And so, a skill like cabinet making or carpentry can be a learned skill, right? He built that shelf as part of learning. So Aristotle even then understood that you learn to be a better builder by exercising those skills you need for building. And we saw, did anybody notice the piano player in that video I showed last night? I told you, I thought they go a little over the top. After about the second or third time, say, oh, okay, I get the message. Yes, developing a virtuous character trait is like playing an instrument. Do we have to cut to this guy again? But for Aristotle, it's like developing the skill of playing a musical instrument. As I said before, you don't, check out a book on learning how to play the guitar or piano from the library, read it on a Friday night, and then on Saturday morning you go and, play a set at the local nightclub. I mean, you have to develop skill. And so he says we become just persons by doing just acts. Now, the way you develop a character trait I should say virtuous. A virtue. Basically, for Aristotle, it's something like this. You perform just actions. In other words, actions that are in accordance with that particular character trait. If you're trying to be, you say, well, hey, I need to be more assertive, more courageous. Well, I'm going to try to make more assertive, more courageous decisions. So it's kind of a circular thing that, by performing, say, courageous actions, you develop the character trait. Say performing just actions like courageous. Right, you develop a particular character trait, like, say, courage. But then, having developed that character trait in yourself, it becomes easier to then act in accordance with that character trait. So it's, oh, sorry about that. Glad you put the cap on. It can be dangerous in here. Gotta watch out for those professors who aren't paying attention. So, in other words, having developed a character trait, it then becomes easier for you to act in accordance with that character trait in the future. It becomes easier to act courageously in situations in the future, you know. Or if you're trying to develop temperance, you know, you make temperate decisions. I'm not going to have that second piece of cake. But then, you know, you kind of quell your craving, say, for sweets, and then it becomes easier, you know, to make temperate decisions. Now, Aristotle's very practical. As I said, he's not like an Eastern mystic who says, well, you know, if you want to develop a particular character trait, you go off by yourself and you meditate on becoming more courageous, and zap, you're going to become more courageous. You know, when you come down from the mountain, you're going to be a more courageous person. No, that's not Aristotle's viewpoint. He's very practical. He's an ordinary person, even though he's a little elitist. Well, he was a lot elitist, all right. And so for Aristotle, developing moral virtues comes about by developing them in community, in our interaction with other people. You know, if you're going to try to be more assertive, trying to become a more courageous person, then the way you're going to develop that character trait is, as I said, not by going off and meditating on what it is to be courageous, but by making decisions in the actual day-to-day world that we would characterize as acting more courageously, acting more assertively in your dealings with other people in the real world. So we do not become morally just in isolation for Aristotle, but we become morally just as we develop virtuous character traits by performing just acts in our transactions with other human beings. So it's very... Now, this is a very important slide. It's something you want to definitely commit to memory. For Aristotle, a virtue isn't at the extreme end of something, at the extreme end of a vice. You know, it isn't like if you drew a line, you know, you'd have a virtue over here with vice at the opposite end. But instead, Aristotle uses this model of a virtue, which is in line with a concept that was prevalent in Greek society called following the golden mean. I read a book by Edith Hamilton called The Greek Way. In high school, one of the things that got me into philosophy was having an English teacher in high school named Carl Yunt, who taught as much philosophy as English, right? He would assign book reports on books in philosophy. And even then, I think I got a decent grade on my book report on Immanuel Kant. But one of the things that I read was a book on early Greek society and early Greek philosophy. We're also reading some of the Greek plays in English, right? And one of their governing principles as a society was that the best course of action was the moderate course of action, or following the golden mean. And Aristotle is very much on board with this concept. Remember, we said that philosophers in the positive part of critical thinking are asking, well, okay, if there were problems with a basic concept we had, like moral virtue, or what a virtue is, can we do better? Can we improve on our definition of what we think a virtue is? And Aristotle asks that question of himself, and he says yes. And here's my more exact model of the concept of a moral virtue. And he says we should view a virtue not as something at the extreme end of the spectrum from a vice, but really a virtue is following the moderate middle ground in our actions, in our behavior, between two extremes, both of which are vices at each end. So the virtue here is the mean, it's in the middle between two vices, one a vice of deprivation. And this is also in line with what Plato said. In other words, if we're trying to develop temperance or self-control, Plato did not look upon the virtuous life as the life of an ascetic, say, something you might get in an Eastern religion where somebody just totally denies the needs of their body. You know, for Aristotle, that's a vice of deprivation. It's easier to see, if we're talking about something like temperance, how gluttony or, you know, drunkenness, in other words, going overboard to excess in our in satisfying our desires for food and drink. It's easier for us to see how that is not something most people would characterize as part of a virtuous life. But for Aristotle, as for Plato, you know, too little of something might not be a virtue either. So a virtue then is following the golden mean, the golden midpoint. But so if we take temperance, then we've already said something about this. So temperance is another word for self-control, right? It also had some other meanings. Anybody recall from their history what the WCTU was and what they did in their political lobbying efforts? Well, none of you were around then. This was long before I was around. This is like in the 1920s. But the pardon? Very good. Very good. See if I had like a smiley face or a gold star, you know, go over there. Right. They lobbied. The WCTU stood for the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and they lobbied to help get prohibition through, you know, no alcohol, right? But this is not exactly what the Greeks would have thought, you know, that the virtuous course is the course of total denial of our body's needs. So for temperance then, or self-control, it would be following the midpoint, that is, satisfying the very real needs of our body for food and drink and, yes, even sexual fulfillment would come into this discussion. But, you know, so not totally denying these, like an ascetic. That's not aesthetic as in art, but ascetic, somebody who denies the needs of the body, like an Eastern mystic who says, I don't need to eat food, I can live off of air and meditation. Well, you know, okay. And of course, self-indulgence in food or drink, especially in food, would be like gluttony on the other side. And so the virtuous course of action is the moderate course of action for Aristotle. And so courage, well, we pretty much know that somebody who's fearful of everything is not acting courageously. But note, for Aristotle, having just no fear. I had a Greek professor, a professor in Greek as a subject. He himself was not Greek. Named Roger Cushy. And remember, when I was in college, if we're talking like in 1970, wasn't all that far from World War II. Many of my professors had actually fought in World War II, and this guy had. And it seems like people from my father's generation, what Tom Brokaw called the, what do you call them? Oh, I'm drawing a mental blank on that. Well, at any rate, people who fought in World War II seem to have had two ways they reacted to it. My father never talked about his World War II experiences. He was a navigator and bombardier in a bomber, right? They flew missions over Germany, and even he was there even on D-Day, apparently. Yeah. Oh, okay. That's what my mother used to say back in the old days when we had a television and an antenna, and my brother or I would be up there adjusting it, and she was trying to see something on the program. She'd say, get to the side, you make a better door than a window. You know, I can't see through you. I'm trying to see this program, and you're up there fiddling with the antenna. Right, so that's the same thing my mother used to tell me. Can you get out of the way? I'm trying to see this. All right. Well, so to get back to this whole thing, people were either like my dad and never talked about their World War II experiences, or they were like my Greek professor and would pepper their lectures with little anecdotes. And I remember one time he was saying, apparently he was like a non-commissioned officer or something, and he was the leader of some men. And he said, we got a new 18-year-old, and the guy, and so they're in an actual gun battle, a firefight with German soldiers, and this guy decides that he's going to stand up and shoot at them. You know, and he doesn't have enough experience to know how good they are, right? You know, like people do in the movies. So he stands up and starts shooting, you know, instead of behind cover, and he gets shot himself. You know, well, you know, for Aristotle, going to excess, being totally fearless in that kind of way, maybe just foolhardy and not really courageous. So courage isn't having no fear at all, you know, but it's following the middle ground and dealing with our fears. It's not feeling no fear, but being able to rationally overcome our fears. So achieving the mean is often achieved against our impulses, right? I want to develop courage. You know what? I need to be more assertive, more courageous. Doggone it. I need a raise. One of my colleagues has gotten a raise who's in a similar situation. I need to develop the courage to go in and confront my boss about a raise. So that's not what you feel like doing. You don't feel like going in there. But, you know, or if you're trying to develop temperance, what your nature says is, hey, you know what? I had a piece of that cake with dinner, but that cake is sitting right in the fridge. I think I'm going to get another piece. I need another piece of that cake. But you're trying to develop temperance, and so you're trying to resist your impulses, right? So very often achieving this midpoint involves acting contrary to what our natural tendencies would be. And he and Plato believe that we can rationally control our actions, that we're not forced in a particular course of action by nature or nurture. You know, in other words, they argue for enough free will that we can go against our impulses using our reason. Now, here we get to the definition of a virtue, and I probably need to add a few more slides. I was looking over this. The Greek word used for virtue is arete, A-R-E-T-E. And it's the virtue or excellence of a thing. And in other words, it's for us to be virtuous is for us to do what we were meant to do with excellence. And the same word for Aristotle can apply to inanimate things. See, for Aristotle, the essential nature of something, in other words, say we're talking about a knife. He talks about a knife. You say, well, the essential nature of a thing, like a knife, for Aristotle, is that it is an implement designed to cut things, right? The essential nature of a pen is that it's an implement designed to write on paper. And so the essential nature of something, its basic nature, is defined by its function. And we don't talk about a knife as being a virtuous knife, but that's the word that's used by Aristotle. I mean, if we were, you know, cooking a meal together and I said, you know, I need to cut through this chicken bone. Hand me that knife over there. It's a really virtuous knife. You'd look at me like I was from the moon. But we do use the word good in both moral and non-moral senses. We can talk about somebody being morally good, but if I need a knife that's going to cut through that chicken bone, I can say, look, give me that knife over there. It's it's a really good knife, and I need a good knife to get through this. We'll use the non-moral sense of the word good. And so a good knife, in other words, if a knife is defined by its essential function as an implement used for cutting, a good knife is a knife that performs its essential function well, or with excellence. And this is the way Aristotle thinks of human virtues, that for us to be a good or a virtuous person is for us to, wow, here I thought I was going to have too much time, and I don't have enough time. It's basically for us to perform our essential function well. And he thinks of us as basically reasoning beings. I'm sorry, I'll tie this up. I was taking my time because I thought, well, I'm not going to get through this whole. I'm going to get through this whole thing and still have 20 minutes left in the period. Look at this diagram, and this will be the last point we'll make. He says plants, all they have is a life principle. That's what separates them from inanimate objects. So just having life isn't what's unique to human beings. Non-human animals, for Aristotle, have life in them, and they also have an emotional life. They can feel pain and pleasure, and But so Aristotle says that's not what's unique to human beings, but he says for him, we can draw a sharp line between human beings and non-human animals at the point of reason. He thinks of us as reasoning beings, and we'll pick it up there next time. Sorry, I was thinking that I had more than enough time, and I wasn't looking at the clock. So we'll finish it up, and then I'll get us into introducing arguments for God next time. So